Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to have this occasion to offer some reflections on the question, which way for our world after the pandemic, as seen through the eyes of the Holy See, including its appraisal of current world affairs. Throughout the ages, as I trust you are aware, the perspective of the Holy See, a state that has a unique and specific spiritual mission, has approached challenges with a vision that goes beyond temporal power. Whether it is addressing economic, technological, or military concerns, the Holy See considers each from the viewpoint of the eternal, attentive to the dimension of human transcendence and the inherent dignity that arises from that existential truth. As a preface to these brief observations, I think it is wise to recognize that even though it has been almost a year since we began dealing with this global pandemic, there is still much about the future consequences of the virus that we cannot fully appreciate. Undoubtedly, we have become conscious of a number of weaknesses exacerbated by COVID-19. The virus has laid bare the vulnerabilities or even inabilities of our healthcare systems, social safety nets, and global finance. Yet, as the Holy Father expressed with great conviction and hope, a worldwide tragedy like COVID-19 momentarily revived the sense that we are a global community, all in the same boat, where one person's problems are the problems of all. Once more, we realized that no one is saved alone. We can only be saved together. End of quotation from Fratelli Tutti. How much further things continue to be challenged and deteriorate will be determined in large part on how quickly a safe, accessible, and effective vaccine can be brought to curb and then to prevent the spread of the virus. And we've had good news in these last days. For the basis of my comments, I will focus on the recent papal encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, which attentively considers the themes of fraternity and social friendship and represents a current assessment of the global situation in which we find ourselves. Indeed, the encyclical addresses many of the socio-economic themes and issues of peace and development that Pope Francis has emphasized incessantly throughout his pontificate, thus demonstrating, if you will, the political priorities of His Holiness and consequently of the Holy See. Anecdotally, I have heard comments which were not intended to be critical of the encyclical, but simply pointing out that the Holy Father raises and then addresses many negative aspects of our social and geopolitical reality, seeing in them many illnesses that must be resolved through an approach of fraternal dialogue and social friendship. Indeed, the negative and challenging realities that we face and need to overcome constitute a sort of leitmotif for the Pope's reflections and are consistent with the Christian dynamic of sin and redemption, of experiencing the pain of the cross before the joy of the resurrection, of overcoming selfishness and pride by way of building family and social cohesion for the common good of all. He explicitly shares his approach to this document when he states, "Although I have written it from the Christian convictions that inspire and sustain me, I have sought to make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among all people of goodwill." Among the dark clouds presently hanging over humanity, there is an ongoing and aggravated fragmentation, indeed polarization, among families, societies, and nations. Pope Francis describes this trend as such: "In today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, and the dream of working together for justice and peace seems an outdated utopia. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference, born of deep disillusionment, concealed behind a deceptive illusion, thinking that we are all powerful, while failing to recognize that we are all in the same boat." The present state of global affairs, which obviously did not come about instantaneously in a vacuum, but rather through an evolution of social, economic, and technological exigencies, have brought about negative consequences that, while perhaps not totally unforeseen, have certainly made social cohesion and peaceful coexistence more precarious. We are more connected than ever through our social networks, but more disconnected than ever from the people around us. Digital relationships, which do not demand the slow and gradual cultivation of friendships, stable interaction, or the building of a consensus that matures over time, have the appearance of sociability. Yet they do not really build community, Instead, they tend to disguise and expand the very individualism that finds expression in xenophobia and in contempt for the vulnerable. Digital connectivity is not enough to build bridges. It is not capable of uniting humanity. End of quotation. This has generated a political and social situation where no longer dialogue, where there is no longer a quest for the truth or even for fact-checking, but a greater division where power and ideology have become the ultimate truth. Pope Francis underscores this worrisome trend, saying, "This has now given free rein to ideologies. Things that until a few years ago could not be said by anyone without risking the loss of universal respect can now be said with impunity and in the crudest of terms, even by some political figures. Nor should we forget that there are huge economic interests operating in the digital world, capable of exercising forms of control as subtle as they are invasive, creating mechanisms for the manipulation of consciences and of democratic process. The way many platforms work often ends up favoring encounter between persons who think alike, shielding them from debate. These closed circuits facilitate the spread of fake news and false information, fomenting prejudice and hate. The result is that we no longer have real political discourse, real political debate, or rational arguments based on principles, positions, and policy, but only political shouting and ad hominem attacks on political opponents. Whether based on fiction or reality, it does not seem to matter anymore. All this weakens democratic forms of governance. This growing polarization is perhaps most obvious at the level of national politics, where we're witnessing in many parts of the world new waves of populism and versions of liberalism that increase division within their own societies and among other countries. The problem is not pride or patriotism for culture and country, but the inability and even refusal to recognize that each nation belongs to a great family of nations, and that each of us has rights and duties towards other members of that family. When forms of nationalism move towards isolationism, negating the common good of all, this can degenerate into an unhealthy populism in which individuals are able to exploit politically a people's culture under whatever ideological banner for their own personal advantage or continuing grip on power, or when at other times they seek popularity by appealing to the basest and most selfish inclinations of certain sectors of the population. This becomes all the more serious when, whether in cruder or more subtle forms, it leads to the usurpation of institutions and laws. I would describe the current geopolitical context marked by growing politicization and diminishing international cooperation as increasingly defined by a crisis of trust. We witness it in numerous ways, including in the weakening of the international system for conventional and nuclear weapon disarmament, or in the inability to overcome long-lasting armed conflicts, a sort of third world war fought piecemeal, as well as with the increasing spread of violations of fundamental human rights. Among these realities, perhaps the situation of global migration, a question dear to Pope Francis, is the most concrete example of the growing distrust and isolationism. He highlights the concern, saying, certain populist political regimes, as well as certain liberal economic approaches, maintain that an influx of migrants is to be prevented at all costs. Arguments are also made for the propriety of limiting aid to poor countries so that they can hit rock bottom and find themselves forced to take austerity measures. One fails to realize that behind such statements, abstract and hard to support, great numbers of lives are at stake. Many migrants have fled from war, persecution, and natural catastrophes. End of quotation. While not raising all the concerns of the Holy See with regard to world affairs, the above-mentioned issues are of primary importance to Pope Francis. Undoubtedly, other pressing global problems like climate change and the violation of freedom of religion and other fundamental human rights are, to use the image of the encyclical letter Laudato Si', all intimately interconnected. The 21st century is witnessing a weakening of the power of nation states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, being transitional, tend to prevail over the political. Given this situation, it is essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions, with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions. When confronted with such serious and systematic geopolitical challenges, it would be easy to become despondent, dejected, and depressed, losing any sense of hope or aspiration that things can change. While we must be realistic about the gravity of these difficulties, we must never lose hope that things can change for the better, not in an instant, of course, but through a renewed effort on the part of each of us to place the human person and the common good at the center of all our considerations and decisions. If we approach our political and social activities through this lens, then we can take steps in the direction of more just societies, more resilient and integrated than before. This, in effect, is what Pope Francis proposes in Fratelli Tutti. He says, despite these dark clouds, which may not be ignored, I would like to take up and discuss many new paths of hope, for God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. What is needed is a change of course. We cannot expect, especially after the devastating consequences of COVID-19, to go ahead with business as usual. The pandemic has exhibited the many weaknesses in a number of our national and international systems. It has laid bare the necessity to strive to develop through greater solidarity, fraternity, and social friendship, institutions and political structures, placing the human person and the common good of humanity above the limited and selfish interests of any specific group or nation. We will come out of this either better or worse, but never the same. As the Holy Father has stressed, unless we recover the shared passion to create a community of belonging and solidarity worthy of our time, our energy, and our resources, the global illusion that misled us will collapse and leave many in the grip of anguish and emptiness. Nor should we naively refuse to recognize that obsession with consumerist lifestyle, above all when people are capable of maintaining it, can only lead to violence and mutual destruction. The notion of every man for himself would rapidly degenerate into a free-for-all that would prove worse than any pandemic. The every man for himself, or similarly every country for itself, mentality cannot endure and is destined to come to ruin, precisely because it is focused on the good of a limited few and is missing the essential element of the common good of all, the indispensable ingredient of social inclusion that is necessary for a healthy society. This requires mutual collaboration, an honest and sincere dialogue that starts from the truth. The Holy Father encourages, together we can seek the truth in dialogue, in relaxed conversation, or in passionate debate. To do so calls for perseverance. It entails moments of silence and suffering, yet it can patiently embrace the broader experience of individuals and peoples. The flood of information at our fingertips does not make for greater wisdom. Wisdom is not born of quick searches on the internet, nor is it a mass of unverified data. This is not the way to mature in the encounter with truth. Conversations revolve only around the latest data. They become merely horizontal and cumulative. End of quotation. Regardless of one's religious affiliations or none, the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan employed by Pope Francis is the underlying hermeneutic for elaborating the notion of fraternity and social friendship, is a convincing reminder that we are all indeed responsible and must do our part to strive for the common good, with a special attention to those on the margins of our societies. It harkens back to the first family of Cain and Abel, where we are called to affirm that we are in fact our brother's keeper. Applied to our times, there cannot be true progress for humanity if certain segments are negated, put aside, or left behind. There is either integral and inclusive human development for all, or only partial progress, which in the end is not development at all. And I thank you all for your kind attention.